Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the final workshop in this series. This week we'll be talking around the theme of accessing the family. Last time we looked at the passage of papers into institutions, so I suppose at this session we're kind of going to be looking at it from the other end of the spectrum and thinking about some of the experiences of people who've been working with papers and collections that are still held by or are still connected to the families that compiled them, or in private families. And I'm delighted to say we have a bumper crop of 3 speakers with us today, which is very exciting. And we've discovered that they were coming from all parts of the globe and thus in different climates, which you can probably tell from the level of jumpers we're under. So with us today, we've got Laura King, who's an associate professor in modern British history at the University of Leeds. We've got Emma Carson, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Adelaide, and Lucy Brownson, who's a PhD candidate, and by the sounds of it, quite near the end now, at the University of Sheffield and Chatsworth House Trust. So they're each going to talk to us sort of 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to throw the floor open for discussion and questions, with the aim of being wrapped up by 11, because particularly for Emma in Australia, it will by then be getting quite late. Just to let you know, this session is being recorded, so if you have any issues with that, let me know before I do anything with it afterwards, and it will be available later on the website. But without further ado, I'm going to hand you over then to our first speaker, who today will be Laura. So Laura, are you able to share your slides with us?
Yeah, let me, host disabled participant screen sharing I'm getting. Oh, you might just have to enable it. You're on mute, Imogen. I don't know if you're trying to say something.
Do you know which button I need to press to enable that? I haven't managed to disable it.
Good question.
You have to go to the security button at the bottom.
Thank you.
either that or make them a co-host if that's been enabled.
I can see lock meeting, enable waiting room, share, allow participants to share screen. There you go.
There we are.
Thank you very much, Janet. Sorry, you can tell I'm missing course of the research support system. Can't you know, I've got to do it myself. Thank you.
Right, I'm hoping. Shout if not. I think that's my screen shared. It's just a few images to. I think that's a little bit more exciting than just watching me while I talk. So yeah, today is a really interesting theme of kind of accessing the family and how we get at families through their private collections when they're still held by the families. And for me, that's meant rooms that look like this. So it's not fancy kind of collections, or we might not even use the word collections because it might be overly formal. This is like the best version of what I've been using when I've been accessing families' own archives. And this comes out of a project that I've been working on for a few years now. Some of you in the audience will know about, where I've been working with a group of family historians. So there's a group of about 15, slightly changing over the course of a couple of years. And we had a period of about 18 months where we met up really regularly, at least once a month, shared information about the research that the family historians were doing. And I provided support, training, but also just wanted to create a bit of a community where people could share what they were doing with their family history research. These were all historians who were based in and around Leeds, so we could meet. It was pre-pandemic that we actually met up, but we could meet and chat and share in person. And so what this looked like in terms of family archives was I asked if I could have a look at the collections that each of these family historians had relating to their families. And as I say, this could really vary. So this was one version of it, someone whose spare room was just full of their family things. She collected everything and anything. And it looked it looks kind of muddled here. I think she was quite organised. This was a family historian called Carolyn. She felt like she wasn't as organised as some of her other family members. But there were such rich things that came out of these many boxes and folders, as well as online materials. And you can see some of the items here. I won't go into them in depth, but you can see kind of the things that Carolyn had, everything from scrapbooks and photo albums that her relatives had collected together, to hairbrushes, and everything in between. So that was Carolyn, and hers was the most extensive archive out of the family historians that I worked with. I guess in the middle was the collections of a historian called Jean, who had all sorts of different things, from a family Bible that she'd inherited, that she didn't quite know who had filled it in and where it had come from and how old it was, but she had a family Bible. She also had scrapbooks and things that she'd put together about the history of her family, as well as all sorts of bits and pieces that she'd collected together. On the left is a poem that one of her brothers had written about another brother who had died in the Second World War. So all sorts of very treasured items. So Jean had quite a bit. And then on the other end of the scale were historians like Bill, who was interested in his family history, had collected together a few bits and pieces and displayed photos in his house, like lots of us do. But his archive, if we want to call it that, was on the smaller end. So he had a handful of items, a couple of bits and pieces of documents, including this scrap of paper you can see in the middle, which was just a couple of details noted down about his grandparents and great-grandparents. So his archive, if we want to call it that, was much more limited, I suppose. And I guess for me, I was approaching these collections by looking at both documents and objects in the same kind of way, thinking about the materiality of all of those things, as well as the items themselves. And for Bill, he had some items that he knew things about. The cigarette case on the right of the screen was his dad's, and he'd kept hold of it because it had belonged to his dad. But he also had things like this First World War medallion on the left, which had belonged to his granddad, but the family couldn't find any record of his granddad's First World War service. His granddad had actually been a miner, so they couldn't quite work out what had happened there and whether he had actually served in the First World War or not, and where this medallion had come from. So this was an archive, if you want to use the term, a collection with many items that Bill treasured and thought were special, but had little idea of where they'd come from and what they symbolised. So the shape of the family archive for me, when we're looking at ordinary families, to use a loaded term, was very varied, from a little folder of bits and pieces to a whole spare room of things, but often it was not organised, obviously, in the way that formal archives are organised. These were collections of things. And this image is the bits and pieces of my own family archive, if you want to call it that I think is probably even less organised and even less kind of formalised than any of the family historians I worked with. So I've been trying to get at this at the moment and work out who has what, and it's mostly photos, like many families, and it's really dispersed and really disorganised across many family members. So the family archive can look like very different things. For me, the way that I've tried to get at family archives is working with family historians, as I say. So setting up a project where I invited them to collaborate with me over quite a period of time has allowed me to access materials, has allowed me to get at these family archives in a way that I wouldn't have been able to anyway. These are just ordinary people's homes and the things in them. But I think the value of collaboration is more than that. It's been about helping me to understand the materials by discussing these objects, these documents, photos with family members over a period of time, and understanding these objects in the context of those family historians' research. So they were all finding more about the people in the photographs, the people on the death certificate, or what have you. And often that meant talking to their other relatives as well. So I was building up a bigger picture through family historians' own research. But I think thirdly, beyond accessing materials, beyond working with them in research terms, it was the kind of emotional relationships that I was developing with these family historians that has helped me really understand these collections in much more full and deep ways, I suppose, by kind of developing relationships of trust and respect and I guess friendship in a sense. I've really been able to dig into these objects and what they mean. So I thought I'd leave with you with a few kind of questions and thoughts that I have some thoughts on, but don't always have the answer to. And they might be things we want to discuss. So the questions that I'm left with are, what are the benefits and challenges of seeing these collections of stuff as archives and their owners as archivists? Is that a helpful way of thinking about it? Or is there too much of a gap between these random collection of bits and bobs and of objects and what a formal archive looks like? Secondly, what does having an emotional stake in these collections do for our research? So having worked with the families involved in these archives over a number of years, I've developed these emotional relationships. And what does that do to have that kind of relationship that's much more close than sometimes when we work on historical collections? And finally, obviously relevant to the slide that I've left you with here, over the last 6 months, I've turned to my own family within this research. So rather than just looking at the 15 or so families that I worked with, I've been looking at my own family too. Like many academic historians at the moment, there's a real turn to this at the moment. And I guess that for me, this has been a way to get inside a family more, because can we ever, as historians, get inside families that aren't our own? So I've been thinking a little bit about how we might get inside families and how we might not just understand their collections, but how those collections were put together, how families make their own histories, and whether the personal side of that, whether looking at our own families is a useful tool there. So I think that's about 10 minutes, so I'll leave it there. And yeah, look forward to discussion shortly. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Laura. It's lovely looking at those pictures, and I already have so many questions. Rather than jump in now, shall we hand over to Emma? Emma, I'm hoping that you will now be able to share your slides with great ease.
I'll just test out that I can. Let's have a look. Can everyone see the slides?
I think it's just considering it. Yes, I can. Can everybody else see
brilliant. All right, I'll pop it on full screen if it'll let me do that. All right, we're all good?
Lovely. Thank you, Emma. That's great.
All right, beautiful. I will get started. So on the 7th of November in 2020 at 6:50 a.m. in the morning, the Australian Broadcasting Company Radio Adelaide talk show host Deborah Tribe interviewed me on her morning segment about my PhD research, which looks at letters that were written between intimate couples during the Second World War. And due to border closures and other COVID restrictions at the time, I was unable to travel interstate to the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, which contains a substantial collection of war letters that have been donated over the years by members of the public. And so because I was severed from this sort of lifeline for my research, I needed to find other sources of war era letters within my own state. One of the collections that I've used since I first started this research is actually a collection that's owned by my own family. It was written between my great-grandparents and was in the possession of my grandmother. And another collection was one that I found through speaking to a mutual friend whose family had their own collection, but that was written between their parents. So it occurred to me that other private collections of letters must exist in South Australia that would be a great resource to tap into while I was unable to travel. So while I had this radio interview at 6:50 in the morning, I made a general appeal to members of the public to contact me if they had any relevant material in their own private family collections that they'd be willing to share with me. And given that this was very early in the morning and I didn't really advertise or self-promote this interview at all, I didn't necessarily expect much of a reception, apart from maybe a few dedicated family and friends and some people who naturally just get up that early. But I was actually pleasantly surprised to receive 8 emails from different people in the community who were eager to share their family stories and relevant documents, including some war letters. And some of the 8 people who did contact me didn't end up actually having relevant stuff. A lot of it was related to the First World War or to collections that were between a parent and their children rather than spouses, which is what my research is really focusing on. But it was still quite fascinating to chat to these people and just to see what people have just gathering dust in their storage as well. So I thought that was quite neat. Let's see if I can, there we go. Right. And the fantastic thing about letters that were written during war is that they provide excellent insights on working class lives and material culture during modern war. They tell us a good amount about the nature of the relationship between writers and, by extension, familial relationships more broadly, what these people believed was important, and possibly even more relevant, what they believed that their recipients thought was important. And private collections that were created by working class individuals were often not preserved beyond the lives of their original creators during this period. But war created a situation in which these objects gained greater significance. And particularly in nations such as Australia, which really mythologise modern war in our national narrative with the Anzacs and other similar sort of stories, there's an assumption that private records relating to war have greater value to historians and to the wider community than other private documents that were produced by working class people. So I believe that this is what motivated more families to keep a lot of these war letters and other similar documents, which they, in many cases, would then donate to public archives, where they would join a pre-existing corpus or would just keep for themselves and decide what to do with them. And also outside of wartime, many working class families had little reason to write large exchanges of letters because they wouldn't face long intervals of separation. So those personal documents and written personal letters wouldn't necessarily exist otherwise. But the privileging of private records relating to war, especially in working class families, does come with some great limitations for researchers, especially when we look at letter collections in public archives. One of the big challenges of using letters as a main source for my research is that insights about pre-war and post-war lives of the correspondents often are entirely absent or very difficult to find in official records. And this makes it difficult for me to make some educated conclusions about whether military service and separation did have an impact on how couples interacted and communicated, especially once the war was over. Some collections and archives do include some supplementary materials such as memoirs or other personal documents, but archives such as the War Memorial especially are unlikely to take on additional material that doesn't relate to military service or wartime experience. So this is where private collections come in, and using private collections that are still in the possession of families does, of course, come with its own challenges. Finding these people, maintaining communication, and obtaining permission and determining the ethics of even interacting with these people when you're doing research with a university can be a wonky process at best. But I have found that in my research, using private collections has filled a lot of gaps that public archival records have. The people who contacted me were typically either the children or grandchildren of servicemen and could provide detailed insights about the lives of these men and their partners outside of their letters. They offered broad recounts of the correspondence relationships after the war, some marriage difficulties that their couples might have, and their own personal interactions with the writers. And naturally, these recollections do come with their own limitations, as we can expect when relying on memory and subjective experience. And because a lot of these people contacted me directly and consciously kept the records that they have in these private collections, it's likely they had a positive relationship with the original writers and would therefore be inclined to focus on some of the more endearing aspects of their relationships with the original person as well, which could affect their testimonies and what they might be willing to share. But I think that you can take these limitations and keep them in mind. And if you realize that not everything should be taken at face value, then the collections and the people who possess them can further enrich research and redress some of the gaps that collections in public archives have, especially those with a military focus. Furthermore, private family collections often include other documents in addition to the letters that provide more information about correspondence and their wider lives. These often include photographs, and as we've already seen, families often would keep their photographs, military records, marriage certificates, official letters that were written between the original correspondence and government or non-government organisations, and newspaper clippings or homemade scrapbooks. So one example of a private collection that I use in my research, as I mentioned briefly at the beginning of this presentation, was correspondence written between my great-grandparents, Bill and Florence Wiseman. And in addition to the hundreds of letters that Bill and Florence wrote during the war, I also have quite a few supplementary documents, including a few photographs, such as the one on this slide here, some of Bill's poetry and his military records as well. My grandmother and one of my great uncles also were happy to share some information with me about their parents' lives, including their lives before and after the war. And this really enriched my understanding of the letters and the relationship between these writers as well. So learning, for example, that my great-grandfather Bill was a troubled man who dealt with his trauma through alcoholism and sporadic violence really differed from the romantic and dedicated husband that he presented in the letters that he wrote. So I think it gave me a bit more of a nuanced perspective of the documents that I was looking at. But as anyone who is looking at records relating to their own families for historical research may have experienced, private collections with a personal connection to them can be fraught with their own challenges. So my family in general has been incredibly supportive, and I feel very privileged to have access to these records. But there is an added layer of pressure that doesn't come from just reading documents in an archive that's public or even private collections owned by other people. Some relatives have expressed discomfort to me or to other people in the family about the idea that me sharing personal information about Bill and Florence might be inappropriate. One of my great uncles in particular was quite upset when I mentioned in passing in my honours thesis that Bill was physically violent towards Florence and their children after the war, which was originally information that I gained from talking with his two siblings. And in addition to that, the detailed recollections of Bill and Florence's sex lives, their arguments, and other very detailed personal information has frequently emerged in the letters, which does make me wonder how some of the family will feel once they read some of my more recent work that includes a lot more of this stuff as well. So another private collection that I've used belongs to a woman named Alison, who is the daughter of an Australian soldier, David Shepherd, and his sweetheart, Barbara Wellborn. And Alison contacted me after the ABC interview. So David and Barbara wrote to each other during the war, and then they subsequently married. And in addition to the letters, Alison recounted their relationship in detail, and she offered some really great supplementary records as well, including photographs of her parents and some newspaper clippings and other similar documents related to her mother's work as a soil scientist during the Second World War. Alison in general was also really eager to hear about my work and to hear advice about preserving the letters. And she also offered to help me photograph the collections of letters so that it would be easier for me to read them, and also to decipher a few sentences that I couldn't quite read on my own. She also periodically checks in to see how my research is going, and we've caught up multiple times to talk about war and my own work over coffee as well, which has been really lovely. I think I've lost it. Oh, there we go. So Stephanie was another woman who contacted me for my ABC interview about a collection of letters relating to her parents, William and Frances Dodsworth. And in addition to the physical letters that she gave me, she also had a book of transcripts of the original letters and some photographs, relevant newspaper clippings and recounts of her parents' lives before, during and after the war. And this included information about her mum's work in the Women's Land Army, which was really awesome. Also some copies of some military and government documents, such as records related to William's imprisonment as a Japanese prisoner of war, and some photographs of the souvenirs that William brought home from his travels as well. And I thought that the pictures of the souvenirs and details about William's post-war life were really interesting as well, because they really differed from a lot of modern narratives about Australian men who became prisoners of war. by Japanese forces, because he ended up ultimately developing a lot of respect for Japanese culture and often returned to the country multiple times for leisure after he was released from captivity. So to summarize, I think that private collections make excellent and often fresh sources of information for academics who are interested in the history of the family. While their use comes with some unique challenges for historians, private family collections also make up many of the shortcomings that documents in public archives often have. They can provide a broad range of items that equivalent collections in archives that are typically more selective about what they will accept and will then allow researchers to then access have. The people who possess the collections also have stories of their own to share, which have historical value and can make excellent contextual information that's difficult to find or absent in documents and other records. Most of the families who have communicated with me about private collections, including most of my family, have been very enthusiastic, trusting, eager to help, and respect my expertise in the field. They want to learn about how to best preserve their artifacts and tell the stories that each object possesses. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emma. I'm now going to try and put up Lucy's slides myself. Can you all see those or not?
No.
No. Okay, hold on.